The moment Alice Langston stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, the red dust of the open plains swirled around her skirts like a warning she refused to heed, and she told herself she had made a terrible, terrible mistake. She stood there on the sun-baked Main Street, her carpetbag clutched in both gloved hands, her dark hair pinned beneath a bonnet already tilted from the long, rattling journey, and she looked out at the sweep of endless grass and sky and felt something inside her go very quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that comes just before a person bursts into tears. Alice Langston was 24 years old, originally from Cincinnati, Ohio, and she had lived her entire life surrounded by brick buildings, gaslit streets, the sound of piano music drifting from parlor windows, and the comforting smell of her mother's bakery on Vine Street. She knew how to press linen, how to read French novels, how to arrange flowers in a crystal vase. She knew absolutely nothing about cattle, horses, open ranges, dust storms, rattlesnakes, or the particular brand of solitude that the Kansas plains handed a person like an unwanted gift. She had come west because her aunt, Harriet Mosley, had written to her from the small ranch settlement outside Caldwell and told her there was work as a school teacher for the children of the ranching families scattered across the surrounding land. Harriet had made it sound almost romantic in her letter. "Blue skies, Alice. The stars at night are something you simply cannot imagine. Come and see." Alice had imagined it, of course, in the way a person imagines something they have only read about. She had pictured clean wooden schoolhouses and cheerful children, and perhaps a tidy little cottage of her own. What she had not pictured was this: the enormous empty sky pressing down on her like the lid of a box, the heat, the smell of livestock and leather, and something underneath it all that she could not name, something raw and alive and indifferent to her presence. A man sitting on the post outside the general store across the street looked over at her. He was leaning back on two legs of a wooden chair with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never once in his life felt out of place. He wore a dusty brown hat pulled low, a faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and leather chaps over dark trousers. His boots were worn but well kept. He had a jaw like something cut from stone and dark eyes that caught the afternoon light in a way that made Alice look away almost immediately, and then, against her better judgment, look back. He was watching her with what she could only describe as calm, unhurried curiosity, the way a man watches something unfamiliar arrive in familiar territory. Alice straightened her spine, picked up her carpetbag with both hands, and walked toward the general store because she had been told her aunt would meet her there. The man did not move as she approached. He just watched, and she resented him for it in the way she resented everything about this place at that moment, which was entirely and without reservation. "Excuse me," she said, stopping a respectable distance from him because she had not yet figured out how to ignore him entirely given that he was sitting directly in front of the door she needed to enter. He tipped the front of his hat with 2 fingers. "Ma'am, is this Hargrove's General Store?" "It is," he said. "Then if you would not mind," she said, gesturing toward the door. He stood immediately, unfolding himself from that chair in one smooth motion, and he was taller than she had expected, broad across the shoulders, and he held the door open for her with a simple courtesy that surprised her enough that she forgot to be annoyed. "Thank you," she said, and walked inside. She found her Aunt Harriet waiting near the counter, a round and sun-browned woman of 50 with gray-streaked hair and bright eyes that crinkled when she smiled, and Alice went straight into her arms with something like relief flooding through her chest. "You made it, you wonderful girl," Harriet said, squeezing her tightly. "I made it," Alice agreed, though she did not yet feel entirely certain that was true. Harriet held her at arm's length and studied her face with the frank assessment of someone who has spent years reading weather signs and livestock moods. "You look pale." "I am always pale." "You look more pale than usual." "It was a very long stagecoach ride, Aunt Harriet." Harriet laughed and linked her arm through Alice's. "We'll get you fed and rested." You'll feel entirely different after a good night's sleep and a hot supper." She began guiding Alice back toward the door, collecting a small bundle of supplies from the counter as they went. "I see you met Orville outside." Alice glanced back toward the door. "I did not meet anyone. I simply asked a man if this was the right store." "That was Orville Hawkins," Harriet said. "He owns the Sunrise Ranch 12 miles out. Best rancher in this entire county, and that is not my opinion alone, that is everyone's opinion." She pushed through the door, and there he was again, still standing near the post, talking now with another man in a similar hat. Harriet called out to him, "Orville, come meet my niece properly." He excused himself from the other conversation with an unhurried word, and crossed the short distance to them. Up close he was even more striking than Alice had registered before, not in a polished way. Nothing about him was polished, but in the way that a landscape is striking. Something about his proportions seemed made for the space around him, as though the land had shaped him to fit it perfectly. "Orville Hawkins," he said, extending his hand to Alice. She took it. His grip was firm and brief and entirely correct. "Alice Langston," she said. "Miss Langston is going to be teaching the children out at the schoolhouse through the summer and into fall," Harriet said. Orville Hawkins looked at Alice with those steady dark eyes, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just slightly, the way a man's expression shifts when he is recalculating something. "How long have you been out west?" he asked. "I arrived approximately 15 minutes ago," Alice said. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "What do you think of it so far?" She looked out at the street, at the dry red dust and the raw-planked buildings and the endless blue sky above it all. She was honest because she was always honest, sometimes to a fault. "It is very large," she said. This time the smile arrived fully, slow and genuine, and it changed his face considerably, made him look younger and warmer, and Alice looked away before she could think too much about that. "It is," he agreed. "You'll get used to it." Alice did not respond to that because she was not at all certain she would. Harriet's farm was a modest but well-kept property, a two-room house with a small garden and a chicken pen and a barn that housed 2 horses and an old milk cow named Bess. It was nothing like Cincinnati. The silence at night was extraordinary, broken only by the sound of wind moving across the grass and the occasional distant call of something wild in the dark. Alice lay in her narrow bed that first night and stared at the ceiling, and told herself firmly that she was a capable and intelligent woman who had chosen this and could endure it. She had not entirely believed herself by morning. The schoolhouse was a single room about a mile from Harriet's property, and Alice threw herself into preparing it with the kind of focused energy she typically applied to any problem she did not know how to solve by other means. She swept it out, organized the few battered books that had been left there, wrote on the chalkboard in her neat hand, and arranged the children's benches in careful rows. There were 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 15, children of cattle ranchers and farmers and a few of the men who worked the smaller homesteads scattered across the surrounding plains. She loved teaching. That part, at least, was familiar ground. The children were rough-edged and sometimes barefoot and entirely uninterested in sitting still, but they were also bright and curious, and they made her laugh in ways she had not expected. Within a week, she had learned all their names and which ones needed extra patience, and which ones were reading ahead of where she had assumed they would be. It was everything outside the schoolhouse that continued to overwhelm her. Harriet did her best to ease Alice into the rhythms of ranch life, showing her how to tend the chickens and how to handle Bess and how to read the sky for weather. But Alice was clumsy with all of it in ways she found deeply humiliating. She was a woman who prided herself on competence, and here she was unable to correctly latch a fence gate or distinguish between a horse that was calm and a horse that was deciding whether to tolerate her. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after her arrival, she was attempting to fill the water trough while Harriet was in town, and she somehow managed to startle one of the horses badly enough that it knocked her sideways into the fence post. She was not hurt, only shaken and dusty and thoroughly disgusted with herself, and she sat down right there in the dirt of the yard and pressed her hands over her face and breathed slowly until the burning in her eyes settled. That was when she heard the sound of hoofbeats coming up the track to Harriet's property, and she straightened up fast and was on her feet by the time Orville Hawkins rode into the yard on a dark bay horse that moved with easy power beneath him. He pulled up and looked down at her from the saddle, taking in the dust on her dress and the flush on her face with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Mrs. Mosley around?" he asked. "She's in town," Alice said, brushing at her skirts with more energy than necessary. He nodded. "I brought over the fencing wire she ordered. I can leave it at the barn if that is all right." "That would be fine," Alice said. He swung down from the saddle with an ease that made it look effortless and led his horse toward the barn. Alice watched him go and then turned back to the water trough, wrestling with the pump handle with renewed determination. She heard his footsteps return behind her and did not look around. The pump handle was sticking again, and she yanked at it with both hands. "You need to prime it first," he said, from somewhere behind her and to the left. She stopped. "I beg your pardon. The pump. It's been a dry week. The seal dries out and you have to pour a little water down it first to get it started." He appeared beside her, produced a small canteen from his belt, unscrewed the cap, and poured a careful measure of water into the pump's top. Then he grasped the handle and worked it 3 smooth times, and water came flowing out freely. Alice watched this happen and felt equal parts grateful and humiliated. "Thank you," she said, in a tone that she worried sounded insufficient for the situation. He handed the canteen back to her. "Keep a little water in this near the pump. Saves the trouble." "I will," she said. And then, because the honesty that sometimes got her into trouble arrived unbidden, she said, "I am not very good at any of this." He did not immediately reassure her or tell her she was doing wonderfully, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. Instead, he was quiet for a moment, looking out toward the pasture. "It takes time," he said finally. "Most things out here do." "I spent the first week trying to convince myself the silence at night was peaceful rather than terrifying," she said, and then immediately wondered why she had told him that. He looked at her then, and there was something in his expression that was not pity and not amusement, but something quieter than either. "What does it sound like to you now?" She considered it honestly. "Still large," she said, "but perhaps a little less hostile." The corner of his mouth curved. "That is progress." He left shortly after, and Alice stood watching the track where his horse had disappeared and felt something she could not quite name, something that was not entirely uncomfortable. Over the weeks that followed, Orville Hawkins appeared at Harriet's property more frequently than Alice initially realized was related to anything other than legitimate ranch business. He brought fencing supplies and a repaired piece of Harriet's equipment that he had fixed at no charge, and once he came with 2 of his hands to help when a section of Harriet's fence line needed replacing. Each time he came, he spoke with Harriet and he spoke with Alice. And each time with Alice there was this quality of careful attention in the conversation, as though he was genuinely listening to every word she said. Alice noticed it but told herself firmly that she was imagining significance where there was none, because she was alone in a foreign landscape, and her heart was foolishly looking for anchors. At the end of May, there was a community gathering at the Caldwell Social Hall, the kind of event that happened periodically in these frontier communities, where everyone came together, because the distances between neighbors were so vast that any occasion to gather was welcome and taken. Harriet brought Alice, dressing her up in her best dress and fussing pleasantly over her hair, and Alice went with a mixture of genuine curiosity and the low-grade anxiety that new social situations still produced in her even after all her years of managing it. The hall was lit with lanterns and smelled of beeswax and fresh pine boards, and the particular combination of good food and many people in close quarters. There was a fiddle player in the corner, and a general cheerful noise that Alice found immediately and unexpectedly warming. The women of the ranching community were remarkable. She had learned, in ways that defied the delicate conventions of the social circles she had known in Cincinnati. They were direct and capable and funny, in a dry, observational way that she found genuinely delightful. She was standing near the refreshment table, talking with a woman named Clara Pratt whose husband ran a cattle operation to the east, when she looked up and saw Orville Hawkins across the room. He was wearing a clean shirt, dark, with the collar properly buttoned, and his hat was in his hand, his dark hair neatly combed, and he was talking with two other men, but he was looking at her. When their eyes met, he did not look away quickly the way she had been doing when she caught herself looking at him. He held her gaze for a moment with those steady dark eyes, and then inclined his head very slightly in acknowledgement, and Alice turned back to Clara Pratt and said something that she afterward could not remember at all. He found her later in the evening when the fiddle had started and people had pushed back the chairs and begun to dance. He appeared beside her with 2 cups of cider and offered one to her, and she took it. "Are you enjoying yourself?" he asked. "More than I expected to," she said honestly. "The women here are wonderful." "They are," he agreed, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has long since arrived at this conclusion. "They run half the operations in this county. Most of them ran the whole operation alone while their husbands were away during the war." Alice looked out at the room, at the sun-browned faces and the capable hands, and felt a new quality of respect layering itself onto what she had already been feeling. "Were you in the war?" she asked. He was perhaps 30, 32 at most, so it was possible. "I was 16 when it ended," he said. "My father went. He came back." A pause. "Not everyone's did." She looked at him sideways. "Your father, is he still living?" "He passed 4 years ago, left me the ranch." He said it plainly, without drama, but she heard the weight of it. "My mother is in Wichita. She remarried 2 years back, a good man." "I'm glad," Alice said quietly, "that she found someone." He looked at her with that expression of careful attention. "And your family?" "Cincinnati," Mrs. Mosley said. "My mother and father are both there," she said. "My mother has a bakery. My father teaches at the university. He would have liked to discuss books with you, I think. You seem like a man who reads." He smiled at that. "What makes you think so?" "The way you listen," she said, and then felt she had said too much of something, though she could not have identified precisely what. The fiddle picked up a lively reel, and around them couples began to move into the center of the room. Orville looked at the dancing and then back at her and said, "Do you dance, Miss Langston?" "I was taught to," she said carefully. "I cannot speak to how I perform in practice." He extended his hand and she took it, and they joined the ring of dancers, and it turned out he was a better dancer than she had imagined a man who spent most of his time on horseback would be. She was laughing by the second pass through the pattern, a real laugh that surprised it out of her. And when the reel ended and a slower tune began, neither of them stepped away immediately. They stood for a moment in the warm lantern light with the music around them, and Alice was aware of the precise distance between them and the warmth of his hand still at her waist. "I have to say something to you," she said, because she could not help herself. "All right," he said. "I think you have been coming to my aunt's property more than your business there actually requires." The slow smile again, the one that arrived without warning and changed everything. "That is probably true," he said. She looked at him. "Why? Because I find you interesting," he said simply, "and because I think you are more suited to this life than you believe you are." Alice felt something shift inside her, something that was half irritation and half something warmer. "You do not know me well enough to say that." "Not yet," he agreed. She did not have a response to that. They finished the slower song in a silence that was not uncomfortable, and then Alice excused herself to find Harriet, and she stood on the far side of the room for the rest of the evening, and tried not to look at him again with any real frequency, which she managed with approximately 50% success. In the wagon on the way home, Harriet hummed to herself in the satisfied way of someone who has seen something she expected to see and is very pleased about it. "Do not," Alice said. "I haven't said a word," Harriet replied. "You are humming." "I am simply in a good mood." Alice looked out at the enormous dark sky scattered with more stars than she had ever seen in her life above the soft black line of the prairie horizon. She had been right that first night, what she had told him. It was very large, but it was also, she was beginning to understand, very beautiful in a way that required time to learn to see. The following weeks brought June in with a heat that was a different animal entirely from Ohio heat. Ohio heat was damp and heavy and closed. Kansas heat was dry and enormous, and came with a wind that did not cool you so much as remind you that you were not, in fact, in charge of anything. Alice's skin adapted faster than she expected. She stopped wearing her gloves and her hands toughened at the palms, and she stopped worrying about the freckles appearing across her nose that would have horrified her Cincinnati friends. She began spending more time at Harriet's animals out of genuine interest rather than obligation. She learned to properly prime the pump, and to move slowly around the horses, and to tell by the sound of Bess's lowing what mood the cow was in. She began waking before sunrise because the mornings were extraordinary, the sky turning colors she had no names for, the air cooler and smelling of grass and distance. One morning in early June, she was standing at the fence watching the sunrise when she heard a horse on the track, and Orville Hawkins rode up looking like he had already been working for several hours, which he probably had. He reined in and looked at her across the fence. "You're up early," he said. "I have been getting up to watch the sunrise," she said. "I realize that is perhaps unusual for someone who called the dark terrifying several weeks ago. Not terrifying anymore." She considered the deep blue and pink spreading across the horizon. Less so. He dismounted and tied his horse to the post, not as though he had planned this but not as though he had either, and he came and stood beside her at the fence. They watched the sun come fully up over the flat horizon, and Alice was aware of him standing next to her with a warm solidity, and she thought about what he had said at the dance about finding her interesting and about being suited to this life. "Can I ask you something?" She said. "Yes," he said. "What made you decide to stay here? You could have sold the ranch after your father passed. You could have gone to a city. You must have had other options." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land with an expression that was not easy to read. "I could have," he said. "My mother asked me that same question." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her that the land needs someone who knows it," he said. "That you can't just walk away from a thing you've been trusted with." He paused. "Also that I cannot imagine living where I cannot see the horizon." Alice looked out at the horizon, that enormous flat line where the land met the sky at a distance that still made something in her chest feel both small and strangely expanded, like breathing deeper than usual. "I am beginning to understand that," she said quietly. "Just a little." He looked at her then, and she met his eyes, and the moment stretched in the warm morning light. "Miss Langston," he said, in a tone that was careful and direct in a way she had come to recognize as characteristic of him, "I would like your permission to call on you properly." Alice's heart did something that she found mildly inconvenient. "You have been calling on me improperly," she said. "I have been calling on your aunt," he said. "Which is the honest version of it." She looked back at the sunrise. "You should know," she said, "that I am not sure I am suited for this life. Ranch life. The wide-open spaces and the hard work and the silences." She said it honestly, because she owed him honesty and herself honesty. "I am still very much a woman from Cincinnati trying to understand Kansas. I am clumsy with most of it, and I miss my mother's bread, and I still sometimes find the silence at night entirely too large." He did not rush his response. He listened to the whole of it, as he always did. Then he said, with a quiet certainty that was not arrogance but conviction, the kind that comes from knowing a thing for a true reason, "You are suited for this life." Alice turned and looked at him fully. "How can you possibly know that?" "Because you get up before sunrise to watch it," he said. "Because you learned to prime the pump and you did not complain about it except to yourself, which is honest. Because you have been here 5 weeks, and instead of writing home for permission to leave you have been tending chickens and teaching children and standing at fences watching the light come up." He was looking at her steadily, not aggressively, not insistently, but with the calm surety of someone who has thought about this carefully. A woman who is not suited to a thing does not look at it like that. Alice stared at him. She was aware that her heart was misbehaving quite significantly at this point, and she was doing very little about it. "That is," she said, somewhat inadequately, "a very specific argument." "I mean it specifically," he said. She looked back at the fully risen sun, at the grass turning gold in the morning light, at the enormous open sky. "You may call on me," she said, "properly." He called on her that Sunday afternoon, arriving at Harriet's door at a respectable hour with his hat in his hand, and his shirt clean and his hair combed. And Harriet offered them the use of the front porch and brought out cold tea, and then disappeared inside with the tactfulness of a woman who has been hoping for exactly this and knows when to remove herself from the scene. They sat in the 2 chairs on the porch and talked for 3 hours without any difficulty at all, which Alice thought was remarkable. She had been to enough social calls in Cincinnati to know that 3 hours of conversation without difficulty was not something that happened by accident. He told her about the ranch, about the particular challenges of the cattle business in this stretch of Kansas, where the weather could be magnificent or devastating with very little warning. He told her about growing up here, about learning to read range and weather from his father, about the community that had formed over the years among the ranching families, a community defined more by practical mutual aid than by social hierarchy, which Alice found deeply interesting. She told him about Cincinnati, about her father's study full of books and her mother's flour-dusted hands, and the particular music of the city at evening. She told him about her 2 younger brothers and the chaos they had produced, and the way she missed them in a low, steady way that she carried everywhere. She told him that she had wanted to be a teacher since she was 8 years old because her teacher that year had told her she asked good questions, and she had loved someone seeing that in her. He listened to all of it with the quality of attention that was becoming familiar and precious to her, and he asked questions that showed he had been listening, not polite questions but genuine ones, and she thought that was perhaps the thing about him that undid her most thoroughly. By the time the evening light was going golden and low across the prairie, Alice had decided privately that she was in a great deal of trouble. He came back the following Sunday, and the one after that. By the 4th Sunday they had exhausted the porch and were walking instead, along the track behind Harriet's property, where the land rolled gently away toward a line of cottonwood trees marking a creek bed. Orville knew the names of every grass and bird and plant they passed, delivered without showing off, simply available when she asked, which she did frequently. He showed her how to read the soil for moisture, and how to tell from the way cattle were standing whether a storm was coming, and how to find the North Star when the whole sky was full of stars, and you did not know which way you were pointed. He taught her these things without condescension, as facts being shared between 2 people, and she absorbed them with the same focus she applied to things she genuinely wanted to know. One evening, walking back along the creek in the long summer twilight, with the cottonwoods making their particular light murmuring sound in the breeze, she slipped on a wet stone at the creek crossing and grabbed his arm for balance, and he caught her with both hands, steadying her, and for a moment they were very close in the low golden light. Neither of them stepped back immediately. "Thank you," she said, which was becoming a recurring theme between them. "You are welcome," he said, which was his recurring answer delivered with that quiet, steady quality. She looked up at him. The evening was warm and the air smelled of water and grass and something that was simply Kansas in summer, and she had stopped minding the smell of it and had in fact begun to find it beautiful. "Orville," she said, testing his name, which she had been using for a few weeks now at his invitation but which still felt significant to say. "Alice," he said back, and the way he said it made something happen in her chest that she chose not to examine too carefully while standing on the bank of a creek in his hands. She stepped back. He let her. They walked back to Harriet's house in the blue dusk, and she went inside and sat down at the small table and wrote a letter to her mother that was 3 full pages long. She told her mother about the land and the sunrises and the children at the schoolhouse, and the way the stars looked at night over the flat horizon. She told her about Harriet and the kind women of the community, and the particular quality of self-reliance she had been surprised to find herself developing. She mentioned, toward the end, that she had met a rancher named Orville Hawkins who had been very kind, and who she thought her father would like to talk to about many things. Her mother wrote back within the week, because her mother was a woman who understood things without being told them directly, and her letter contained one line that Alice read 3 times. He sounds like a man who sees you as you actually are, which is what matters most. July arrived with storms. The Kansas summer storms were unlike anything Alice had experienced, building on the horizon with a dark theatrical drama, and arriving with thunder that she felt in her sternum and lightning that lit the prairie white, and she had to admit they were magnificent in a way that was almost frightening. She stood on Harriet's porch during one, and watched it with her heart hammering and her eyes wide, and she thought she understood now why people came here and why people stayed. It was on a Monday morning after a particularly violent overnight storm that Orville rode up to Harriet's place with 2 of his ranch hands, because a section of fence on Harriet's north line had been knocked down in the wind and cattle could stray. He organized the repair with efficient calm, and Alice brought out water and helped where she could, and at some point found herself working alongside one of the hands, a young man named Thomas, holding fence posts in position while Orville strung wire. By noon the fence was repaired and Harriet had produced a meal that she insisted everyone sit down to, and Alice sat at the outdoor table between Harriet and Thomas and across from Orville and listened to the conversation move easily around her and felt, for the first time, that she was not a visitor observing this world from the outside. She was part of the table. She had worked this morning. She had contributed something. Orville caught her eye across the table, and she looked quickly at her plate, but she was smiling, and she heard in her own memory his voice saying, "You are suited for this life," and she thought that perhaps, just perhaps, he was right about something. August came, and with it, a situation that tested the community in a way Alice had not anticipated. A drought that had been building quietly through the dry weeks in late July hardened into something real and worrying. The creek behind Harriet's property dropped to a trickle. The grass went brittle and yellow in the heat. Ranchers began moving cattle to areas with better access to water, and there were long conversations at the general store and at the church social about grazing rights and water sharing that had an edge of tension beneath the civil surface. Alice watched and listened and understood that this land gave no guarantees, and the people on it had built their lives on a foundation of work and adaptation rather than certainty. She thought of what Orville had said about land needing someone who knows it. She thought about what it meant to commit to something that could not promise anything back. One evening when he came to walk with her, she told him what she had been thinking. "The drought worries me," she said, not because she thought she could help with it, but because she had been carrying the worry for several days. "Me too," he said plainly. "Is your herd going to be all right?" "We'll move about 1/3 of them to the north pasture where there's more water access. It means extra work and tighter margins this quarter, but we'll manage." He said it without self-pity or drama, just the statement of a problem and its solution. "How do you do that?" she asked. He looked at her sideways. "Do what?" "Just face it like that, without needing it to be different than what it is." He was quiet for a moment, and the evening wind moved through the dry grass around them. "I suppose," he said slowly, "because needing it to be different doesn't help anything. The land is what it is, and the season is what it is, and the only useful thing to do is work with what you have in front of you." Alice walked beside him in the warm, dry evening and thought about that, about working with what you have in front of you, about looking at the actual situation instead of the one you had expected or hoped for. "I was afraid when I came here," she said. "Not of specific things, just of not knowing, of not understanding the rules of a place. And now." She looked at the horizon, at the dry golden grass going to dark under the evening sky, Now I think I am learning some of the rules, she said. The ones that matter. He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to face him. Alice, he said, and the way he said it was different now, more direct, with a weight in it that she recognized. I want to say something to you that I have been thinking about for a while now. Her heart did its inconvenient thing. All right, she said. I have been thinking about whether this ranch needs a woman who knows it the way I know it, or whether it might become something even better if there were two people learning it together. He held her eyes steadily. I have been thinking that you are the most honest person I have met in a very long time, and that you see things clearly and ask good questions, and that you have been out here since May and you have not quit, which matters more than most people understand. His voice was quiet and deliberate and entirely serious. I am not asking you for an answer tonight, but I am telling you that I am thinking about a future, and that future has you in it if you are willing. Alice stood in the dry August evening on the Kansas prairie and looked at this man who had watched her arrive in a cloud of red dust and told her she was suited for a life she did not yet know how to live, and she felt something settle in her chest like a decision arriving from somewhere deep and certain rather than from careful deliberation. I am thinking about it too, she said, which was honest and which was, for the moment, the right amount. He nodded, one firm, quiet nod, and they turned and walked back in the dark toward the light of Harriet's lamp in the window. September brought the drought's end in a week of steady soaking rain that left the grass green again, and the creek running full, and the ranching community exhaling collectively with relief. It also brought the end of Alice's first school term, the children dispersing back to their families' harvest preparations, and the question of what she would do next. She had been writing regularly to her parents, and in early September her father replied to several months of accumulated letters with a response that was characteristic of him in its length and its precision. He discussed the natural history of the plains with great enthusiasm, having consulted several books on the subject, and then near the end of his letter, having read all that she had told him and read carefully between the lines of it, he wrote, "Your mother says you have found something true out there, Alice, and I think she is right. Your descriptions of the land are not the descriptions of a woman who wishes she were elsewhere. Whatever you decide, decide it for yourself." She read this letter twice, sitting at Harriet's kitchen table in the September morning, and then she folded it carefully and sat for a while watching the light move across the wall. She thought about Cincinnati, about the brick streets and the gas lamps and her mother's bread and the sound of the city. She loved those things. She would always love those things. They were her first language, the language in which she had learned to understand the world. But she was learning a second language now, and she found she did not want to stop. Orville came that Sunday afternoon. He was later than usual, arriving in the golden late afternoon light of early September, and he seemed more quietly purposeful than the easy manner she had come to know, which made her notice him even more carefully than she usually did. He sat on the porch with her in the long afternoon light, and he asked her how she was doing, and she told him honestly, as she always did. "I've been thinking about what you said in August," she told him, "about the future." He was still, in the way he was still when something mattered. And I want to be honest with you about something." She looked at her hands in her lap and then back at him. "When I came here in May, I was certain I did not belong. I thought ranch life was for a particular kind of woman, someone raised to it, someone tougher than me. I told myself that for weeks." "I know," he said. "You told me so. And you told me I was suited for it," she said. "I still believe that." "I am beginning to believe it too," she said, and she looked at him. "That is what I wanted you to know, that whatever you are thinking about the future, you should know that I am not afraid of this life anymore. I am not a woman who is tolerating it until she can go home. I am a woman who has started to learn it and who wants to keep learning it." He looked at her for a long moment in the golden light. Then he said, "Then I'd like to ask you properly." Her heart went still and full at once. He stood up from his chair, and he did not kneel, not in the formal theatrical way she might have imagined in Cincinnati, but he stood before her with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her with that steady, direct look that had been seeing her clearly from the beginning. and he said, "Alice Langston, I would like you to be my wife. I would like us to work this land together and build something on it that is ours, and I promise you that I will spend my life being worthy of what you would be trusting me with." Alice stood up because she did not want to be sitting when she answered something this important. "Yes," she said, clearly and without hesitation. "Yes, Orville." And he smiled, the full open smile that she had been storing up every time it appeared, and he reached out and took both her hands in his, and she could feel the warm roughness of his palms and the steadiness of his grip. And she thought that this, right here, this man and this land and this light, was something she was going to spend a very long time being grateful for. Harriet appeared in the doorway 3 minutes later with a face that suggested she had been listening through the screen, which she absolutely had, and she burst into tears of joy and embraced them both simultaneously, and the porch rang with her happy noise, and Alice laughed into her aunt's shoulder. The wedding was planned for October, before the full chill of autumn set in. It was a community affair, because weddings in this part of Kansas were community affairs, everyone contributing something, the women organizing food and the men organizing chairs and tables brought out from the social hall, and the whole proceeding happening on a clear blue Saturday with the October light going gold and cool over the prairie. Alice wore a dress her mother sent from Cincinnati, cream-colored wool with small buttons at the wrists, and she stood at the edge of Harriet's yard with the whole county gathered around her, and she looked at Orville Hawkins waiting for her at the far end of the yard by the preacher, and she felt so certain she could not imagine having been otherwise. She walked to him without a father to escort her, because her father could not make the journey in time, and she had told him in her letter that she would carry him in her heart instead, which he had replied to with a letter full of feeling that she had kept and would keep for the rest of her life. She walked through the gathered neighbors and friends, past Clara Pratt, who was weeping in the good way, past Thomas, who was grinning, past all the familiar faces that had become her people over these months, and she reached Orville and he took her hand and she could feel the steadiness of him beside her. The preacher was a practical man, and his words were direct and warm. They spoke their promises to each other in the clear October air, Alice's voice clear and Orville's low and sure, and when it was done, he pressed his lips to her forehead, and then to her mouth, briefly and gently, and the gathered people made the sound that people make when something true and happy has been witnessed. They moved to the Sunrise Ranch in the days after the wedding. The house was a solid 2-story structure that Orville had been adding to and improving for several years, and he had prepared the upstairs rooms with a care that told her he had been thinking about this for a while. There was a shelf for her books beside a window that looked east, and she stood looking at it on the first evening, and felt something she could only describe as recognition. The winter came that year with particular force. The Kansas winter was not like Ohio winter, which was cold but familiar. Kansas winter was a different element, enormous and relentless, with winds that came off the open plains with nothing to stop them and storms that kept everyone indoors for days at a time. Alice had been warned about this, and she had told herself she was ready, but the first real blizzard that arrived in December and kept them housebound for 4 days gave the winter a scale she had not fully imagined. But she was not alone in it. Orville was there, and they used those 4 days well. He taught her to play cards. She read aloud to him from one of her books. They planned the spring planting of the kitchen garden. He carved a figure for her from a piece of wood by the fire, and she thought she had never felt more thoroughly at home in a place that was still teaching her to belong to it. By the time spring came and the snow melted back into the earth, and the grass began its improbable return from brown to green, Alice was keeping books for the ranch operation, a task she had taken on out of practical observation that the records could be better organized, and which she had turned out to be genuinely good at. Orville had handed over the account ledgers with a kind of surprised relief, and she had reorganized the system within a week in a way that made the financial situation of the ranch considerably clearer. "You should have been doing this from the beginning," she told him, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledgers spread around her. "I didn't know you could," he said. "You didn't ask." "Fair," he said with that slow smile and leaned over to press a kiss to the top of her head. She looked up. He was looking at the ledgers with something like satisfaction. She reached up and touched his jaw, and he turned his face toward her hand. And she thought about the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in red dust and thought she had made a terrible mistake, and felt the distance between that woman and this one like a landscape she had crossed. In the spring of 1883, Alice began teaching again. Not in the old schoolhouse, which had fallen into some disrepair over the winter, but in the repaired and better organized building that the community had come together to fix up after Alice spent the better part of February writing letters to the county about the state of the school. She was more confident now in every direction, and the confidence showed in how she taught and in how she moved through the community with an ease that she recognized as belonging. She and Clara Pratt had become genuine friends, riding out to visit each other regularly. Clara was a practical and funny woman who had been ranching alongside her husband for 12 years and who knew more about cattle medicine than most men in the county. She and Alice could talk for hours about anything from land management to books to the particular injustices of a system that called women's labor invisible while depending entirely on it to function. "You know," Clara said one afternoon when they were sitting on the Sunrise Ranch porch watching the late spring evening light move across the pasture. "Everyone was curious when Orville brought home a schoolteacher from Ohio. There was some speculation that she would last about 6 weeks. "I know," Alice said. She had heard this directly from more than one person in the community, all of them said with current warmth and past amusement. "How long did you think I would last?" Clara considered this honestly. "I thought perhaps a whole winter," she said, which was already an optimistic estimate by local standards. She looked at Alice with a smile. "You surprised everyone." "I surprised myself," Alice said. "The best ones usually do," Clara said. The summer of 1883 was kind, with good rain and reasonable heat, and the cattle on the Sunrise Ranch fat and content. Alice had by now entirely found her footing with the horses, including Orville's dark bay, which she had named Handle because of the particular musical quality of his walking gait. She rode out regularly on her own sorrel mare, a steady animal named Bess II in honor of Harriet's cow, and the freedom she felt on horseback on the open prairie was something she had not anticipated and could not now imagine surrendering. She and Orville rode out together most evenings when the day's work permitted, covering ground and talking or sometimes not talking, just moving side by side through the enormous quiet with the sky going through its colors above them and the grass moving in its slow perpetual wave. And she thought this was one of the best things in her life, this particular freedom and this particular company. In August of 1883, she told Orville she was expecting their first child. He received this news by going very still for a moment, and then reaching for her hands and holding them with such gentle care that she laughed at the contrast to his usual matter-of-fact handling of everything. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "Stop looking at me like that." "Like what? Like I might break?" He relaxed his expression with visible effort. "You are not going to break," he agreed, and then the full, genuine smile arrived. "We are going to have a child." "We are," she said. He pulled her close and held her with the careful warmth that was one of the things she loved most about him, and she pressed her face against his chest and listened to his heartbeat and felt the particular fullness of a happiness that was complete, that had its roots in real ground. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Alice managed with the same practical energy she applied to everything else on the ranch. She continued teaching through the fall, Harriet and Clara and several other women of the community closing around her with practical help and cheerful company, and in March of 1884 she and Orville's son arrived. They named him James Langston Hawkins, James for Orville's father and Langston for Alice's. He was red-faced and furious at the world in the first days, which Alice told Orville suggested he had a healthy opinion of himself, and dark-eyed like his father, and he occupied the following months with an intensity that surprised Alice, who had thought she knew what caring for a child involved. She had not, she discovered, known anything of the sort. Motherhood was enormous in a way she had not anticipated, all-consuming and humbling and filled with an unreasonable love that arrived on the first day and never reduced. She wrote to her mother, "How did you do this twice? How are you still standing?" Her mother wrote back, "You keep standing because they need you to and because there is nothing else you would rather be doing. Both are true at once." Her parents came in the summer of 1884, her father and mother making the long journey from Cincinnati by train and then stagecoach, arriving in Caldwell on a July afternoon dusty and wide-eyed and full of questions. Her father was immediately enchanted by the landscape in the way of a man who has read about a thing and is delighted to find it actually exists in the form he had imagined. Her mother went straight for baby James, held him with practiced efficiency, pronounced him magnificent, and then looked at Alice's face and said, "Oh, you are happy," with the soft satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting to see this confirmed with her own eyes. Her father and Orville spent 3 evenings on the porch in conversation that ranged from natural history to the cattle business, to books to the peculiar politics of the frontier territories. And Alice sat in the doorway listening, and felt something knit together inside her, her two worlds meeting in the lamplight and finding they had more in common than she had expected. Her mother found her one morning standing at the kitchen window looking out at the range while James slept, and she came and stood beside her and looked at the same view. "Do you remember your letter in May of last year?" her mother asked. "The one where you told me the silence at night was large." "I remember it," Alice said. "And now?" Alice looked at the wide Kansas morning, at the grass and the sky and the distant shapes of cattle moving slowly across the middle pasture, at Orville's figure on horseback coming back from the far fence line. "Now it is exactly the right size," she said. Her mother smiled and squeezed her hand and said nothing else, because nothing else was needed. After her parents left, carrying James's baby portrait and several of Alice's letters tied with ribbon, Alice stood with Orville in the yard watching the wagon carry them back toward Caldwell, and felt the quiet gratitude of someone who has everything they need and knows it. "Your father told me something the night before they left," Orville said. "What did he say?" "He said that when you wrote to your mother in May of last year, he had expected you home by October." He looked at her sideways with a quiet amusement. "He said he had been entirely wrong about what kind of woman his daughter was." Alice laughed. "He was paying attention to what I thought about myself rather than what I actually was." "There is a difference," Orville said. "You saw it before I did," she said. He reached for her hand without looking at her, just found it naturally in the way you reach for something you know exactly where to find. "I saw what was already there," he said. "You did all the rest." The years that followed wrote themselves in the particular language of that life, in seasons and harvests and the slow building of things that take time to fully become themselves. The Sunrise Ranch grew through careful work, adding pasture and improving the herd, weathering bad seasons and building on good ones. Alice taught at the schoolhouse through the following years, and she and Clara Pratt and several other women in the community organized what became a small lending library of books, brought in shipments from Wichita and distributed through the church, which Alice considered one of the more satisfying practical accomplishments of her life. She and Orville had a second child in 1886, a daughter they named Harriet Me, after Aunt Harriet, who had by then become as central to both their lives as family can be, and who appeared at the birth holding Alice's other hand and saying encouraging things throughout in a voice that only cracked once. Harriet Me was her father's daughter in temperament, quiet and observant and slow to act but certain when she did, and she had her mother's eyes and the particular stubborn competence that Alice had discovered in herself on the Kansas plains. She followed Orville around from the time she could walk, wanting to know the names of everything, and he told her with the same patient willingness he had once used on Alice herself. James grew into a boy of considerable energy and curiosity, with his grandfather's love of books and his father's love of the outdoors, and Alice watched him sometimes in the evening reading by the lamp, while Orville cleaned tack at the table, and thought that this ordinary quiet scene was the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed. In 1887, the community faced one of the harder seasons. A severe drought combined with a disease that moved through cattle herds across southern Kansas hit many of the ranching families hard, and the Sunrise Ranch was not exempt. They lost a significant portion of the herd, and the financial year was brutal. Alice expanded her bookkeeping work to other ranching families who needed help tracking their losses and navigating the credit arrangements that would carry them through. And Orville spent months working with neighbors on collective solutions to the grazing and water problems that the drought had exposed. It was a hard year, and they came through it changed in some ways, more stripped down, more certain of what actually mattered. Alice noticed that she had not once during those months thought about what it would be like to be elsewhere. She had not thought about Cincinnati or easier lives. She had thought only about the problem in front of her and how to be useful within it, which she thought Orville had been right about all along. This was her nature. She was suited to this. She told him so one evening in the fall of 1887, when the drought had broken and the herd was slowly being rebuilt and the worst was behind them. They were sitting on the porch after supper, James and Harriet me asleep inside, the evening cool and clear with stars beginning to appear in the enormous Kansas sky. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" he asked. "About what you said to me that morning at Harriet's fence," she said, "the second time we really talked, when you told me I was suited to this life." He looked at her in the low evening light. "I remember. I have thought about that so many times," she said. "In the drought, when James had that fever last winter, when the books would not balance in October and I sat at that table until midnight. Every time something was hard I remembered that you said that." She looked at her hands in her lap. "It made a difference, Orville, more than I can explain." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something went deep. Then he said, "You made the difference." I just said out loud what I could already see. "No," she said, gently insistent. "You said it before I could see it in myself. That is not a small thing. That is everything." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together in the quiet evening with the stars coming fully out above the prairie horizon. That enormous dark sky scattered with more light than she had been able to imagine that first night when she had called it too large. And she thought about the woman she had been, and the woman she had become. And she thought the distance between them was measured not in failure but in learning, not in loss but in addition. In the years that followed, the Sunrise Ranch became what Orville had worked toward, a well-run operation of good reputation, known for the quality of its cattle and the fair dealing of its owner. Alice's teaching at the school continued until James and then Harriet me were old enough to be her students, which produced some domestic comedy they would recount for years. But she also began writing occasional pieces for the county newspaper, practical articles about household economics and community organization, which were read and discussed and occasionally argued about, which she considered a mark of success. Aunt Harriet's health began to slow in 1889. She was a woman of enormous vitality, and she did not slow gracefully or without protest, but she slowed, and Alice began spending more time at her property, taking over the heavier work with help from two of Orville's hands, sitting with Harriet in the evenings over tea. They talked about everything, about the years before Alice arrived and the years since, about what this land required of people and what it gave in return. "Did I make the right call, writing to you?" Harriet asked one evening, not sentimentally but with her characteristic directness. "You did," Alice said. "It was the best letter anyone ever sent." Harriet made a sound of satisfaction. "I thought you would be good out here," she said. "I just wasn't certain you would see it fast enough." Orville helped with that, Alice said. Harriet smiled. I know, she said. Why do you think I pointed you out to him that first day? Alice stared at her. You pointed me out to him. Harriet looked entirely unapologetic. I may have suggested when he came in to pick up supplies the week before your arrival that my niece was coming and that she was an exceptional young woman. She lifted her cup with the satisfaction of someone who has been waiting years to deliver this particular information. Alice thought about the man in the chair outside the general store, already there, already watching. She shook her head slowly. You are a meddling woman, she said. I am an accurate woman, Harriet said. There is a difference. Harriet Mosley passed away in the spring of 1890, quietly and at home, and with Alice holding her hand. She left her property to Alice, which in practical terms meant it was absorbed into the Sunrise Ranch and added to what they had been building. But in every other sense, Alice kept it distinct in her mind as the place where she had first learned to prime a pump, and first stood at a fence watching a sunrise, and first understood that she might belong to this land after all. Alice was 32 that spring, and she stood in Harriet's yard the morning after the burial and looked out at the Kansas prairie in the early light, and felt the grief and the love and the gratitude all at once, none of them canceling the others, all of them true. Orville was beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say and because he knew it. She wrote me the right letter, Alice said. She did, Orville agreed, and you said the right thing. When, at the fence, she said, that morning with the sunrise, she looked at him. You told me I was suited for this life. He looked back at her with those steady dark eyes that had been seeing her clearly from the beginning. You were, he said. You are. She leaned into his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stood together in Harriet's yard in the spring morning, with the light coming up gold over the prairie, and the grass moving in its slow, perpetual rhythm, and the enormous sky above them full of the particular blue that Kansas spring mornings produced. And Alice thought that this was the most honest thing about her life. This ground under her feet, and this man beside her, and this sky above everything. James was 6 that spring, already reading chapter books from the lending library, and asking questions about the cattle operation with a seriousness that made Orville laugh and answer at equal seriousness. Harriet Mee was 4, following everything James did with fierce determination, and already showing the particular combination of her parents that people who knew them both found amusing to observe. In the summer of 1890, Alice discovered she was expecting again. She was 32, and the third pregnancy was harder than the first 2 in the physical sense, but she moved through it with the steady pragmatism she had been cultivating for 8 years. The community women gathered around her again, with the warm, practical support that she had come to know and depend on and contribute to in equal measure. Clara Pratt brought food weekly and sat with her on the porch and made her laugh until her sides ached. The third child arrived in February of 1891, another son, dark-eyed like his father and sister, and loud about his opinion of the situation from the very first moment. They named him George Harriet Hawkins, the middle name in honor of the woman who had started everything, which seemed exactly right. The Hawkins family sat at the kitchen table on a Sunday evening that spring, James reading and Harriet Mee drawing on a slate and George asleep in the basket by the stove, and Orville doing accounts while Alice read a letter from her mother, who reported that her father had recently acquired a book about Kansas natural history and was rereading it for the 3rd time. The lamp made its warm circle, and outside the window the prairie evening was enormous and starlit and completely right. Alice looked up from her mother's letter and looked around the table, at James's bent head and Harriet Mee's small focused face and George's sleeping weight in the basket and Orville across from her with the lamplight moving across his jaw. She thought about the stagecoach step, the red dust, the too large silence. She thought about a man in a chair outside a general store watching her arrive. She thought about what it meant to be seen before you could see yourself. She thought about what it meant to be told, simply and without flinching, that you belong to the thing you are afraid of, that you are capable of the life you have not yet learned to live. that the person in front of him, dusty and uncertain and resolutely honest, is exactly the right person for exactly this place. She thought about how a single sentence, spoken at the right moment by the right person, can be the thing that lets you finally look at the life in front of you and say yes. "Orville," she said. He looked up from the accounts. "I want you to know," she said, "that I am grateful every day for what you said to me." He looked at her for a moment, and the slow, warm smile arrived in the lamplight. "Which particular thing?" "You know which thing," she said, and he did. She could see that he did, and that he understood why she was saying it now in this kitchen, surrounded by all the things they had built together. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That was what made it true." James looked up from his book, sensing some quality of silence between his parents that children learn to recognize as significant. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "Something that happened before you were born," Alice said. "Something important." "What happened?" Harriet Mee asked, looking up from her drawing with her father's attentive dark eyes. Alice looked at Orville, and he looked at her, and the lamp made its warm circle around them all. "Your mother came from very far away," Orville said to his children, in the tone he used when he was telling the absolute truth, "and she was very brave about something that frightened her, and I could see that even though she could not quite see it herself yet." "And then what?" James asked. "And then," Alice said, "I learned to prime a pump and watch sunrises and read the weather in the grass, and I found out that your father was right." She looked at Orville again across the circle of light. "Which he usually is, though I would prefer that not go to his head." Orville laughed, the full open sound of it, and James laughed because his father was laughing, and Harriet Mee smiled her slow, certain smile, and George shifted in his basket and settled back into sleep, and the Kansas evening pressed against the windows with its enormous peaceful dark, the same silence Alice had once found too large, now wrapped around the house like an embrace. Outside, the stars were out in their full prairie abundance, hanging over the flat horizon in their uncountable thousands, the same stars Orville had once used to teach her which direction was north, and Alice thought that she had learned something much more essential than that, though north was useful too. She had learned that belonging is not a place you are born into. It is a place you earn and build and choose and keep choosing, every morning at the fence watching the light come up, every evening in the saddle on the open range, every winter storm and summer harvest and year of hard work and honest conversation. It is the sum of all the mornings you got up and did the thing that needed doing even when you did not know you could. And it is the person who sees that in you before you see it in yourself and says so, plainly and without condition. She thought she would tell their children this someday, when they were old enough. Maybe James first, who asked good questions and would want the honest answer. She would tell them about the stagecoach and the red dust and the silence that was too large, and about the man in the chair outside Hargrove's general store who watched her arrive with calm, careful eyes. She would tell them that their father had said to her, on a spring morning at a fence with the Kansas sun coming up over the prairie, "You are suited for this life." And she would tell them that she had believed him, eventually, and that believing him had become the truest thing about her. George made a small sound in his basket, and Alice rose and lifted him, settling him against her shoulder where he went immediately quiet, and she stood by the kitchen window looking out at the dark and the stars, and the house was warm behind her, and the prairie was immense and beautiful before her, and she was exactly where she belonged, which she now knew had always been the case. From the moment she had stepped off that stagecoach, and the red dust had swirled around her skirts like a welcome, she had not yet learned to read.